It was 5:09 in the morning when the ridge above Belcourt stopped feeling like part of France and started feeling like the end of the world. The night was not gone yet. A pale gray hung over the hills, the kind of light that makes everything appear like a half-finished sketch. The trees along Saint Laurent Ridge were shadows. The shallow valley below was a bowl of fog. And somewhere inside that fog still moved, and men shouted in a language Daniel Mercer did not speak, but had learned to fear. Inside the turret of the Sherman tank that his crew had named Judith, the air already tasted of cordite and sweat. Mercer stood half-hunched, headset pressed to his ears, one gloved hand resting on the edge of the open hatch. His other hand held a single shell. It was marked in stenciled letters that glowed faintly in the low light. Smoke white phosphorus. He was not supposed to be holding it. The manual said smoke was to be used under strict orders to conceal a retreat or mark a target for aircraft. The instructors back in England had called it wasteful in most situations and dangerous in the wrong ones. White phosphorus was fire trapped inside a shell waiting to spill out in burning flakes that stuck to skin and cloth. Used carelessly, it could cook your own men alive. Used without authorization, it could end a career. Used now, it might be the only thing that kept 200 Americans from being swallowed whole before the sun rose. The radio in Mercer's headset crackled again. A calm, distant voice spoke, as if reading from a printed sheet far from the valley and the fog and the smell of fear. All units on Saint Laurent Ridge maintain position. Do not engage unless fired upon. Reinforcements are en route. Repeat. Hold your ground. Reinforcements are en route. The words were as steady as the tick of a clock. Mercer glanced at the valley where those orders were supposed to make sense. Through his periscope, he could see only bands of gray and the faint suggestion of movement. Tracks, maybe. Infantry shapes. Artillery flashes deeper in the fog. Nothing clear enough for a report. Clear enough, though, for the tightness in his chest to get worse. He let the shell rest against his thigh and breathed slowly. The shell felt heavier than it should. 23 pounds of steel and powder and chemistry and judgment. If he fired it without permission, it would be disobedience recorded in ink. If he did not fire it, he could watch 2 infantry platoons and a forward observer team torn apart while he sat still and waited for reinforcements that might arrive to an empty hill. In his memory, the world flickered like an old projector, and for a moment he was not on that ridge in Normandy at all. He was in Ann Arbor 5 years earlier, smelling chalk and machine oil instead of cordite. The classroom had high windows that let in winter light. Drafting tables were lined up in straight rows, and Daniel Mercer leaned over one of them with a pencil in his hand, drawing the curve of a suspension cable. Then came December 7th. It was the only date that did not need a year or a calendar around it. They listened to the radio in the student union and watched the color drain from faces that only a week earlier had been arguing about football and exams. There was anger and fear and something else that Mercer had trouble naming, but felt very clearly. It was the sense that history had opened a door, and you could either walk through it or spend the rest of your life wondering why you stayed seated. He enlisted in the Army not because he craved combat, but because he could not imagine continuing to sketch bridges while other men crossed oceans to fight. When given the choice of training, he went to the Armored Corps. Tanks at least made sense. They were steel and gears and engines. They obeyed laws of physics instead of speeches. In the training grounds in England, he met Judith. That was what his crew decided to call the Sherman assigned to them. The name was painted in white on the barrel as a joke at first. Over time, the name felt less like a joke and more like the name of a stubborn animal that might listen to you if you treated it right. He also met white phosphorus there. One morning, an instructor rolled a shell onto a wooden table in front of a group of fresh tankers. The man was a veteran from North Africa, with a face that already looked tired of war. He tapped the shell lightly with a knuckle. "This here is smoke. White phosphorus. You think it is just a way to hide. You are wrong. This is fire that crawls and clings. Use it right and it will cover your friends. Use it wrong and they will never forgive you, or they will not live long enough to try." Someone had asked about regulations and the instructor had smiled without humor. Regulations say you wait for permission. The battlefield does not read regulations. Remember that. Then remember that if you decide you know better than the paper and you are wrong, there will be a reckoning. Those words echoed now on Saint Laurent Ridge. Mercer looked around the interior of Judith. The narrow space hummed with tension more than with the engine. Luis Navarro, the loader, sat on the bench near the breech, rubbing his hands together, even though it was not cold. He was from New Mexico, and he coped with fear by talking about anything other than fear. Today he was strangely quiet. At the front of the hull, Frankie DeLuca, the driver, had one hand on the control levers and one on a lucky coin that he claimed came from a card game in Brooklyn. He cursed more than he prayed, and in his own words, he drove like a man who believed that brakes were for other people. Beside him, hunched over the radio set, was Hank Collins, 19 years old, from Missouri, and still looking as if someone had put a kid into a uniform that belonged to an older brother. Hank had barely spoken since they moved into position on the ridge. He listened to the radio like a man listening at a door behind which something terrible moved. These were not commandos from recruiting posters. They were 5 young men inside 33 tons of steel, waiting for someone far away to decide what their next hour would look like. Mercer spoke into his throat microphone. Report. Owen Ricker, the gunner, did not look up. Nothing clear. I can see shapes in the fog. Could be trees. Could be tanks. Navarro managed a thin grin. Bad day when you cannot tell trees from tanks. DeLuca muttered something about how from in here all trees looked like coffin wood. Hank raised his head slightly. Command says reinforcements are coming up from the West Road. They want us to hold and cover Charlie Company and Able Company until then. Mercer pictured the map in his head. The West Road curling behind Belcourt sounded safe on paper. On paper, that road belonged to them. On the ground, he was less certain. He shifted and pressed his eye to the periscope again. He swept slowly across the valley. At first, there was only gray. Then he saw it, a darker smear in the fog sliding along the line where the road should be. Smoke from an engine. The shape of armored hulls. German. He watched long enough to be sure. Then he felt his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with motion. The West Road is not ours anymore, he said quietly. Ricker glanced up. You sure, sir? Mercer nodded. I am sure enough that if Charlie Company tries to withdraw along that road, they will be running straight into German fire. The headset crackled again, as if to argue with him. All units prepare to execute withdrawal to phase line copper via West Road through Belcourt. Repeat. Withdraw to phase line copper via West Road. On the other end of that message, someone in a tent with a clean table and a tidy map believed that the road was still open. On that person's map, little blue symbols still had a clear line of retreat. On the ridge, Daniel Mercer watched the real road disappear under the treads of enemy armor. He felt the familiar split open inside him. On one side stood the part of him that had been trained to obey orders and respect the chain of command. On the other side stood the part that had studied bridges and load limits and knew that when numbers on a page failed to match the weight they were supposed to carry, reality did not care about intentions. On paper, they owned that road. In the mud, the Germans did. He heard shouting outside. The first scattered groups from Charlie Company were already pulling back through the scrub toward what they thought was safety. Men carried others on their shoulders. One soldier stumbled past the front of Judith with a bandage already dark on his arm. They were all headed toward the west without knowing that the west had turned into a killing ground. Mercer opened the hatch wider and let the cold, wet air hit his face. It smelled of damp earth and exhaust and the metallic tang of distant explosions. Somewhere below, a machine gun opened up, and the harsh, chopped sound rode up the slope like an accusation. He looked at the shell in his hand. Smoke, white phosphorus, Pandora in a casing. Navarro saw the look and swallowed. You are not really thinking about using that, are you, sir? Mercer did not answer at once. He watched as another stretcher team appeared in the fog. 4 men carried a fifth. One of the carriers slipped in the mud, and they all went down in a tangle. The wounded man tried to push himself up with one good arm. Somewhere beyond them, artillery walked its way up the ridge with a lazy, methodical rhythm. Somewhere else, German armor pushed in from the south, closing the vise. If they stay here, they die, Mercer said softly. If they take that road, they die faster. The radio hissed again. Hank listened carefully. Forward observers report heavy contact from the south. Request fire support. Command response negative. Risk of friendly fire too high. Maintain position. Reinforcements still en route. Navarro let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. So we sit still and hope the enemy has read the same script. Mercer studied the valley one more time. The fog shifted for a moment, and he saw the burning wreck of an American Jeep near the bend in the West Road. Above it rose a lazily twisting column of black smoke. The wind took the smoke and drew it eastward in a long, faint trail. He followed that trail with his eyes. He imagined what another source of heavier, thicker smoke might do if it were placed in the right spot. The instructor from England spoke again in his memory. The battlefield does not read regulations. If you decide you know better than the paper and you are wrong, there will be a reckoning. Maybe there would be. Maybe that reckoning would come with a formal hearing and a reprimand that followed him home. Maybe he would never build another bridge, but a prison wall of paper instead. He thought of the men stumbling through the fog outside. He spoke without raising his voice. If the book cannot get us out of here, he said, then we write a new page. Navarro stared. Sir. Daniel closed his hand around the shell and felt the cool metal beneath his glove. Louis, get that round into the rack where you can reach it fast but keep it covered. I am not ready to pull the trigger, not yet, but I want options when the time comes. That sounds like you are planning to get us all court-martialed, DeLuca muttered. Better that than buried on a road we were told was safe, Mercer replied. He ducked back down into the turret and pulled the hatch most of the way shut. The world outside became a narrower circle of gray framed in steel. Time began to thicken. Minutes stretched. Reports came through the radio in fragments that made no comforting picture. Contact here. Road cut there. Units missing. The supposed reinforcements on the West Road were quiet or already gone. Charlie Company fell back in ragged clusters across the ridge. Able Company reported Germans in the trees to the south. The forward observers lost one of their radios to shrapnel. Men shouted coordinates through static only to be told that artillery could not fire because no one could see where the front line ended and the killing zone began. Mercer watched it all and felt that there was a weight settling onto his shoulders that had nothing to do with the helmet he wore. He was a lieutenant, a junior officer, a former engineering student who had believed that in war, there would always be someone above him to make the crucial decisions. Yet here on Saint Laurent Ridge, the chain of command stretched away into the fog until it connected to people who did not see what he saw. He looked again at the valley and the trail of smoke from the burning Jeep. He watched the way the wind took it, west to east, west to east. He thought about what white phosphorus would do if it burst somewhere along the line between them and the encroaching German armor. He imagined a wall of blinding gray behind which 2 infantry platoons and a handful of artillery observers might disappear long enough to reach a new line of defense. He also imagined the same wall rolling back over them if the wind shifted even a little. His heart beat slow and heavy. Every thud counted down seconds. He heard Ricker clear his throat. Sir, if we are going to do something, we should probably do it before those tanks get close enough to see our teeth. Mercer did not answer immediately. He looked at each of the men in the cramped space of the turret, Navarro trying to look anywhere but at the smoke round, DeLuca gripping his lucky coins so hard his knuckles were white, Hank with one hand on the radio and the other pressed to the side of his neck as if feeling for his own pulse. They were waiting for him, not for headquarters, not for the voice on the radio, for him. He thought of a bridge design class. The professor had drawn a line on the board representing a span between 2 towers and then added weight until the chalk line bowed. Every structure has a moment, he had said. 1 more pound and it holds. 2 more and it fails. At some point you stop calculating and you decide. On St. Laurent Ridge, Daniel Mercer realized that he had reached that moment. He took a breath that tasted of oil and fear and something else. Responsibility. Hank, he said, keep listening for any word that the West Road has been retaken. Until then, we treat it as enemy territory. No one goes that way if we can help it. Yes, sir. Owen, keep your sight on that line where the road disappears into the trees. If anything big moves through that fog, I want you ready with armor piercing. Got it, sir. Louis, make sure you can load that smoke round fast when I ask for it. Do not mix it with the others. I do not want it going into the tube by accident. You sure about this, sir? Mercer met his eyes. I am sure about this much, he said. Doing nothing is also a decision, and it is the one I am least willing to live with. Outside, another artillery shell burst. The sound rolled over the ridge and into the turret where it vibrated in their bones. The battlefield was not reading the regulations. It was reading the choices men made when the pages ran out. On Saint Laurent Ridge, Daniel Mercer made his first one. White phosphorus was never designed to save lives. It was designed to blind to burn, to turn clear air into something a man could choke on. But as Daniel Mercer looked out over St. Laurent Ridge, as he watched the fog and smoke twist above a road that no longer belonged to his side, he found himself thinking of it as the only thing left that might keep his people alive. The next artillery blast landed somewhere down the slope. Earth and rock rattled against Judith's hull. The turret shivered. A faint dusting of dirt fell from the interior roof onto Navarro's shoulders. No one flinched much anymore. You could get used to almost anything given enough time, except the feeling that every second you waited was a second stolen from someone trying to crawl out of a trap. All units, came the voice in Hank's headset. Maintain position. Do not engage unless fired upon. Reinforcements are advancing along West Road. Hold your ground. Hank repeated the words inside the tank with the numb, flat tone of a man reading a verdict. They still think the West Road is theirs, Mercer said. His voice was quiet, but there was no doubt in it now. They are sending the rescue through a road the enemy already owns. He looked at Navarro. Luis, smoke round. Bring it up. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Navarro blinked as if he had misheard. Sir, bring it up, Mercer said. Right now. Navarro reached into the rack where the white phosphorus round had been stored apart from the others. He handled it as carefully as if it were made of thin glass instead of thick steel. The stenciled letters on its side looked almost harmless. He wrestled it into place near the breech and looked at Mercer again. You do know this could go bad fast, he said. Mercer nodded once. If it goes bad, that is on me. You load when I say load. That is on me, too. He switched his attention to the front. Frankie, keep us steady. I want a clear shot into that strip between us and the road. Owen, look along the line where the Jeep went up. See that curl of black smoke? That is your reference. We put our smoke just a little closer than that. High airburst. We need a wall, not a hole. Ricker pressed his eye to the sight, adjusting elevation by small, careful degrees. I see it, he said. Ugly little column. I can put another one beside it. Mercer felt his own heart beat slow. Not calm exactly, just focused. The way he had felt in school when the professor erased all but one problem from the board and said, this one will tell me who did the work. He spoke into his throat microphone. Attention, all units on St. Laurent Ridge. This is Judith Actual. When you see smoke bloom in front of our line, you move west under cover of it. Do not stop on the ridge. Do not wait for orders. Use the smoke and go. Hank stared at him, eyes wide. Sir, that is not an authorized transmission. You want to stamp it first, Hank, or you want to save some people? Mercer replied. Send it. Hank swallowed and repeated the message into the net. For a moment there was only static. Then a couple of strained voices answered. Judith, this is Charlie Company. You had better be right about this. We move when we see it, came another from Abel. Mercer drew in a deep breath. It tasted of stale air and nerves. Load smoke, he said. Navarro slammed the white phosphorus round into the open breech, shoved it home, and stepped back. The shell clicked into place with a sound that seemed loud enough to summon every enemy gun in Normandy. Ready, Ricker said. Mercer lifted his eyes to the narrow slice of sky visible through the open hatch. The fog there was thinning, streaked with the first hint of color from the coming sun. A morning that would belong to someone. He intended it to belong to his men, and not to the men in gray rolling toward them. Fire, he said. Inside Judith, the blast of the main gun was a physical thing. It punched through their chests and rattled their teeth. The tank lurched slightly from the recoil. Outside, unseen from where they sat, the white phosphorus shell split the air on its way toward the invisible line Mercer had chosen. Then it detonated. There was no sharp explosion like a high explosive round. Instead, the shell burst with a strange muffled sound and a bright flash inside the fog. In an instant, thick gray-white clouds began to curl outward from the point of detonation, billowing down toward the ground and sideways across the field. From the perspective of a private in Charlie Company named Harold Brooks, it looked like the sky had opened and poured smoke instead of rain. He had been dragging a wounded friend by the straps of his web gear, lungs burning, ears ringing from the last near miss. He saw the flash and threw himself flat, expecting shrapnel. None came. Instead, tendrils of gray rushed toward him, swallowing stones and brush and bodies as they went. "Gas," someone shouted behind him. "Christ, they are using gas." Brooks pulled his scarf up over his mouth out of pure instinct. The smell that hit him was acrid and biting, but his skin did not blister, and his eyes did not go blind. The world simply vanished into a swirling curtain. The distant shapes of tanks that had been stalking the ridge melted away. Bullets that had been whining past found only fog. For the first time since dawn, the bullets stopped having faces. On the German side of the field, Hauptmann Klaus Ritter raised his field glasses and cursed under his breath. One moment he had a patchwork view of the ridge, American figures in foxholes and at gun pits, a single Sherman on the crest. The next moment an opaque wall of smoke rolled across his sector, cutting the scene in half. Visibility ceased, he muttered almost to himself. An officer beside him spoke. "Is it their artillery, Herr Hauptmann, or aircraft?" Ritter did not answer at once. He had seen smoke before in Italy, had watched American units vanish behind similar clouds shortly before shells rained down on his own men, or before infantry emerged in surprising places. White phosphorus had a color and a way of rising that he recognized. It meant the enemy was doing something that did not match the last report on your desk. "Either their artillery is about to speak," Ritter said slowly, "or they have decided to retreat under cover of that smoke. If we rush forward blind and they are waiting with guns in place, we walk willingly into a slaughter." His radio operator tugged his sleeve. "Panzer platoon reports they are ready to push through, sir." They asked for clearance. Ritter hesitated. Through the glasses he could see nothing but gray. No shapes, no movement, only the boiling smoke creeping closer to his forward elements. He thought of fuel levels, of the lack of Luftwaffe cover, of the warnings from higher command, that this attack had to succeed quickly or not at all. He also thought of how many names he would have to write if he threw his men into a fog that might hide prepared guns. "Hold them," he said at last. "Tell them to wait until the smoke starts to thin. No one advances into that screen until I can at least see where the Americans are not." It was a cautious order, the kind of order that saved men and sometimes lost battles. On Saint Laurent Ridge, the effect of that single order was invisible but immense. German tanks that had been grinding forward stopped. Infantry that had been moving up dropped to a knee or stayed in their tree line. The vise around the ridge paused. It did not open, but it stopped closing for a few precious minutes. Inside, Judith Mercer watched the smoke roll and felt his throat tighten. He could not see the exact shape of what he had created, only the edges of the gray wall as it drifted across the ground below. It thickened quickly, blotting out trees and wrecks, and the faint lights of muzzle flashes. For a moment, an eerie quiet settled over the slope. Even the guns seemed unsure of themselves. Now Mercer said into the radio, "All units move. Use the smoke. Go now." He repeated it louder. "Move now. Do not wait for formal orders. This is your window." On the ridge, scattered clusters of men heard him. Harold Brooks in Charlie Company felt a hand clamp down on his shoulder. He turned to see his platoon sergeant face streaked with mud and smoke. "You heard the man," the sergeant rasped through his scarf. "We are not dying up here just to keep a hill on some general's map. Up and move. Stay low. Stay in the gray." Brooks hauled his wounded friend to his feet. Together they staggered forward into the curtain, following the ghostly outline of other men. In another pocket of the ridge, the forward observers, who had watched their own radio sets shatter under shrapnel, now grabbed what they could carry. One of them limped over to Judith, slapped the side of the tank hard enough to sting his palm, and shouted, "Nice trick, tankers. You just bought us a way out." Mercer did not answer. He was busy watching the limits of his own creation. To the south, the smoke thickened and flowed like a slow river. Figures passed through it, barely visible before being swallowed. Some coughed and cursed, eyes streaming from the sting of the chemicals. Others simply ran equipment, clattering boots pounding. Judith sat like a marker at the edge of the fog turret, slowly traversing. "We keep the barrel moving," Mercer told Ricker. "Let them think we have more shells and more friends than we do. Hank, give me any German transmissions you can catch. If they sound confused, we are on the right track. DeLuca looked uneasy. Sir, are we sure that stuff is not drifting back on us? We are sure enough, Mercer said. The Jeep smoke told me what the wind wants to do this morning. It wants to help us. For once. The stillness did not last. After perhaps 90 seconds of uncertain quiet, a German machine gun on the left flank opened up, firing blind into the smoke. Its harsh, tearing sound cut through the fog like a buzzsaw. Tracer rounds stitched red lines into the gray, disappearing where American shapes moved unseen. Somewhere inside that curtain, a man screamed. Another voice shouted a name with rising panic. There they are, Navarro muttered. Someone did not get the hold order. Mercer did not hesitate. Owen, look for the muzzle flash. Suppression fire only. We are not playing hero, we are playing distraction. Put a high explosive round just close enough to make them think there are more of us than there are. Ricker found the flicker of orange in the swirling smoke and trained the sight on it. The gun bucked again. This time the recoil felt less like a shock and more like an answer. The shell burst in a stand of trees where the machine gun had been hidden. The explosion turned branches into splinters and added its own plume of dirt and smoke to the growing confusion. For a moment the German fire stuttered and went silent. On their side, men in gray helmets shouted to one another in the same confused tone that had filled American radios only minutes ago. Some swore they were under heavy coordinated attack. Others argued that the Americans were already gone, and this was merely a covering action. No one seemed eager to be the first to step into the unseen. For every second they argued, another American slipped behind the smoke. From his hatch, Mercer counted. He could not see the men clearly, but he could see motion. Shapes in ones and twos and small groups moved from the exposed ridge into the relative safety beyond the crest. He estimated how many had been up there when the shell went off. He compared that to how many shapes he had watched vanish into the curtain. We are getting them out, he said quietly. Navarro let out a breath. You know, sir, for a useless round, this thing is doing a decent job. Do not start writing poetry about it yet, Mercer replied. We are not done. More German guns joined the first. MG fire swept blindly back and forth. Occasionally a short scream cut across the slope. Not everyone would make it. No trick on earth was perfect. Mercer felt each sound like a small hammer tap at the back of his mind, adding to a weight he knew would not lift easily later. Another shell from the German armor landed closer, sending a shower of dirt over the Sherman. The impact made Judith rock on her tracks. They are firing blind with the big guns now, Ricker said. If one of those lands right inside our little fog bank, it will not matter whose smoke it is. We stand until the last of them are past us, Mercer said. Then we go. DeLuca twisted in his seat. Sir, no offense, but that sounds like a fine way to end up the only ones who do not get out. Mercer did not raise his voice. Frankie, look at that ridge line behind us. He gestured toward the rear periscope. See those men, the ones still coming through. DeLuca glanced and saw a struggling column from Able Company, 2 men carrying a third on an improvised stretcher. They were slower, weighed down not only by their comrade but by exhaustion. If we pull back now, Mercer said, those men become the last ones on the hill. The enemy will have a clear line to them. We are the last thing making this look like a planned withdrawal instead of a rout. We move when they move, not a moment before. DeLuca looked at the men again and said nothing more. The little procession of wounded and lagging troops passed Judith's hull one by one. Some slapped the armor as if thanking a living thing. Others did not even look up, too focused on placing one foot in front of the other. The smoke was beginning to thin at the fringes now. The wind that had worked in their favor would not hold forever. The last group from Charlie Company appeared at last, 2 men carrying a third whose leg was bandaged from thigh to ankle. The bandage was soaked dark. They stumbled and nearly dropped him. Mercer leaned out of the hatch and shouted, "Keep moving. Do not stop. We are right behind you." One of the carriers looked up, face streaked with grime and disbelief. "You are crazy, Lieutenant," he shouted back. "But thank you." When the last of them disappeared into the fading wall, Mercer finally nodded. "All right, Frankie," he said. "Now we are the last ones out. Take us through." Judith lurched forward. The tracks bit into the churned earth, and the tank rolled toward the smoke it had created. As soon as the hull entered the edge of the gray curtain, The world closed around them. Inside the tank, the air grew thicker. Even with hatches cracked, the fumes seeped into every corner. Throats burned, eyes watered. Navarro coughed and swore between breaths. DeLuca squinted through the driver's slit that showed him nothing but shifting white. "Feels like driving through milk," he said. "Angry milk." "Keep us straight," Mercer said. "Slow and steady. Do not give them an easy shot at our sides." From somewhere to their right, a German machine gun opened up again, the sound muffled by the smoke. A string of bullets slapped across the side of the hull, ringing like urgent fists on a metal door. One ricochet sparked off the edge of the turret. Hank flinched and ducked instinctively. "Are we hit?" he blurted. "If we were, you would not be asking," Navarro answered. A moment later, a deeper boom sounded. A tank gun. The blast was followed by a frighteningly close impact that made Judith jump. Dirt and debris pelted the roof. "That one was looking for us," Ricker said, voice tight. Mercer had seen a glancing hit on the front right where the armor sloped. The round had not penetrated, but the mark was there, a fresh scar of bare metal surrounded by scorched paint. "Return fire," he ordered. "Same principle. Aim for where you think they are, not where you wish they were." Ricker swung the turret toward the source of the last flash he had glimpsed through the haze. His finger tightened on the trigger. The main gun answered again. The shell vanished into the curtain. For a split second, the smoke ahead lit up with the hot orange of an explosion as the high explosive round hit a tree line where a German position had been guessed if not precisely seen. Then the gray closed over everything again. Silence followed. That silence in war was never comforting. It meant guns were adjusting, thinking, waiting. It meant something would happen next and you would not know what until it did. They pressed on. The smoke grew thinner by degrees. First, they could see vague shapes at arm length, then further. The white curtain tore into streaks and tatters. Cool air began to mingle with the heated chemical breath. In the distance, the ground rose toward the secondary line that staff maps had called Line Gray. Then they broke through. Judith climbed the last shallow slope and came out of the smoke like a ship emerging from fog. The first rays of morning sun cut across her armor, revealing streaks of soot and fresh scars. Below the ridge on the safer side, a scattering of truck sandbag emplacements and hastily dug foxholes formed a rough fallback line. Men were there, dozens of them. Some sat on the ground coughing. Others lay on stretchers as medics moved among them. A few stood with rifles scanning the ridge as if expecting ghosts to emerge. When they saw the Sherman come through intact, a ragged cheer went up. It was not loud, not organized, but it carried. DeLuca let out a long breath he had not realized he was holding. "We made it," he said softly. Mercer climbed partially out of the hatch, letting the cooler air wash over his face. Someone from Charlie Company staggered forward, still hoarse from smoke and shouting. He slapped the armor with his open palm. "That smoke trick was you, Lieutenant," the man said. "You and your crew." Mercer looked past him at the thinning wall on the ridge top. It was still there, still buying seconds for any straggler who had not yet crossed. It was also already beginning to fray under the rising sun. He thought of a bridge again. How long it held before the load became too great. How you never really knew if your calculations were right until someone walked across and it did not fall. "We fired one shell," he said, half to the soldier and half to himself. After that, it was everyone deciding to move. He watched as the last shreds of smoke curled and faded into the morning. Somewhere behind that veil, German officers would be sorting out reports, arguing about what exactly had happened. Somewhere on some future day, a staff officer would study this moment and give it a title. For now, it was just survival. And survival felt very much like a secret bargain between fear and judgment that he had been allowed to win, at least for one morning, on one French hill. The smoke that had carried them out still drifted in ragged strands above St. Laurent Ridge, when the big sounds of the fight faded into smaller ones. Coughing, low voices, shovels scratching at raw earth. Behind the new line, everything looked temporary. Trucks stood at odd angles. Sandbags formed crooked walls. Foxholes were shallow depressions where men had dropped more than dug. Soldiers sat where their legs had given out. Some hacked the taste of white phosphorus from their lungs, eyes red and streaming. Others stared back toward the ridge, quietly counting who had come through the gray and who had not. Medics moved among them, jackets already stained. They tightened bandages, checked pupils, pressed canteens to split lips. Every so often, one of them would straighten, look up the slope, and shake his head, as if still trying to understand why so many of the men here were breathing at all. Judith rolled to a stop just behind a line of sandbags. Her engine idled down and died. The sudden quiet inside the hull felt almost as unnatural as the roar had a few minutes before. Mercer climbed out of the hatch. His legs wobbled and then steadied. He dropped to the ground and pulled off his helmet, letting cool air scrape across sweat-soaked hair. For the first time since dawn, he allowed himself to look away from the periscope and at the scattered clusters of men who had moved when he told them to run. A lieutenant from Charlie Company limped toward him, helmet, crooked face streaked with soot. He looked as if someone had shaken every thought out of him, except surprise. "You Mercer?" he asked. "Yes," Mercer said. The man stuck out a hand. "Robert Hale. I took 2 platoons onto that ridge. I still have 2 platoons. That is not what the map said this morning. Whatever you fired turned a grave into a doorway." Mercer shook his hand. The grip was firm but unsteady. "We fired 1 shell," he said. "Everyone else did the hard part." Hale gave a dry, humorless laugh. "From where I was, it did not look like 1 shell," he said. "It looked like the world grew a door right where we needed it." "You read the wind. That is the only reason we are talking instead of lying up there with tags on our boots." He glanced once more toward the fading smoke, then walked back to his men. Word of what had happened moved through the division faster than any official message. A sergeant said a tank on the ridge had fired a forbidden smoke round. A forward observer added that the shell had burst in exactly the right spot and that German tanks had stopped cold rather than drive into the fog. A medic remarked that for a trap that tight, there were far too many men on his list breathing and far too few dead. Numbers took shape by midday. Nearly 200 men from Charlie and Abel and the observer team had come off St. Laurent Ridge. 14 were listed as seriously wounded. The dead were there, but not in the numbers the situation had promised. The list of lost guns and vehicles was long. Command could live with that. Steel could be replaced. Trained men could not. At regimental headquarters, the first map of the day had carried a red circle around the ridge and a penciled word beside it. Lost. A staff officer had drawn it with his jaw clenched already, composing the line about heavy casualties. By late afternoon, the circle remained, but the word had changed. Held. Under it, in cramped script, someone had added a note. Smoke employed contrary to standing orders. Responsible officer to be identified. The name found its way upward, with the same speed the rumor spread sideways along the line. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer, Sherman Judith, 30th Division. An orderly found him sitting on an ammunition crate beside his tank, rubbing at a smear on his helmet more for something to do with his hands than out of concern for shine. "Lieutenant Mercer," the man said. Mercer looked up. "Yes. You are requested at regimental headquarters, sir." "Immediately." "Requested," Navarro said when the orderly had gone. "That is the word they use when they want you worried on the way in." DeLuca shrugged. "If they wanted the whole crew, they would have sent a truck," he said. "Looks like they only want the man who said the word fire." Mercer stood and settled his helmet back on. "Stay with Judith," he told them. "If anyone asks whose idea the smoke was, tell them to wait until I get back." Hank frowned. "You sure you want to walk in there alone?" "If this is about that round," Mercer said, "there is no point in anyone else sitting in the chair." "I gave the order." He left them there and walked toward the village where the division had set up its brain. The school that had once held children now held maps. Jeeps crowded the playground. Sandbags flanked the stairs. Inside, the air smelled of plaster and coffee. Children's drawings still clung to a hallway wall, their bright colors half hidden behind pinned orders and signal charts. A sentry led Mercer to a classroom where the chalkboard was covered in maps instead of lessons. 3 officers sat behind a plain table. A single chair waited facing them. Mercer saluted. "Lieutenant Daniel Mercer, reporting, sir." The man in the center wore colonel's eagles and rimless glasses. To his left sat a major with a notebook. To his right, a captain with legal insignia. At the end of the table sat another officer whose uniform carried a silver star and the tired eyes of someone who knew foxholes better than offices. "At ease, Lieutenant," the colonel said. "Sit." Mercer sat. The chair creaked. "I am Colonel Reed, Divisional Staff," the man said. This is Major Watson from Logistics, Captain Garrity from Legal, and Lieutenant Colonel Avery visiting from another division. We are here to discuss your use of white phosphorus on St. Laurent Ridge this morning. Yes, sir. Reed glanced at a report. Our information states that you ordered the firing of a white phosphorus shell without prior authorization and in direct violation of standing orders. Do you dispute that? No, sir, Mercer said. You were fully briefed on those orders. Yes, sir. Major Watson leaned forward slightly. You understood the risks, he said. That white phosphorus can drift unpredictably, that it burns whatever it touches, that a misjudgment could have killed your own men as surely as the enemy. I did, Mercer replied. Then why, Captain Garrity asked, did you choose to fire it? Mercer thought about smoothing the answer. Then he let it stand as it was. Because he said, when I looked down that west road, I saw German tanks, not our reinforcements. The withdrawal order was sending men into a route that did not exist anymore. If we stayed where we were, they would close on us all the same. The only tool I had that could change what the enemy saw fast enough to matter was that one smoke round. He kept his eyes on Reed, his voice level. I watched the smoke from a burning jeep, he went on. It told me the wind was steady. If we put our shell in front of us and a little short, the smoke would roll toward the enemy, not back over our own line. It was still a risk. None of the choices were safe. That one gave us a chance they had not accounted for. The room went quiet for a moment. Artillery rumbled somewhere else like distant weather. You understand, Garrity said, that in other circumstances, such a choice could lead to charges. Disobeying direct orders, misuse of restricted munitions, endangering friendly forces. I understand, Mercer said. If that is what the board finds, I will accept it. Lieutenant Colonel Avery had been silent until then. Now he spoke. How many men do you believe got off that ridge because of that smoke, he asked. Mercer thought of faces in the gray. The counts I heard put it just under 200, sir, he said. Infantry and observers. Avery nodded. I have read some of their statements, he said. They describe a position closing like a fist. They also describe a wall of smoke that froze German armor and gave them a way out. They do not talk about clever wording in orders. They talk about running through gray that should not have been there. He folded his hands on the table. People will say you gambled, he went on, that you rolled dice with those men. I do not see it that way. His voice dropped just slightly. You did not gamble with their lives, Lieutenant. You gambled with your own career to save their lives. There is a difference. Reed looked from him to the other two officers. Major, Captain. Any objection, he asked. Watson shook his head. From supplies' point of view, he said we can replace guns and trucks. 200 trained men are another matter. Garrity hesitated, then nodded. Regulations are written for the normal day, he said, not for mornings when everything goes wrong at once. I have no objection. Reed picked up his pen. The board finds he read as he wrote that Lieutenant Daniel Mercer acted outside standard protocol, but in accordance with battlefield necessity and sound tactical judgment. No disciplinary action is recommended. That is the official decision. He set the pen down and looked at Mercer without the paper in front of him. Unofficially, he said, I would not advise making a habit of this. Not every risk ends with 200 men alive. No, sir, Mercer said. You are dismissed, Reed replied. Go back to your crew. There is still a campaign in front of us. Mercer stood. At the door, Avery called after him. Lieutenant. Sir. Next time you are standing on an edge like that, Avery said, remember what you started as. An engineer. Let the numbers line up before your nerves do. Mercer allowed himself the smallest smile. I will, sir. The hearing ended without ceremony. It left a line in a file, a story that moved from mouth to mouth, and a small change in how some officers thought about smoke. In the weeks that followed, a handful of training officers asked Mercer to walk them through his decision. How far had the shell flown? How quickly had the smoke built? How long before the Germans began firing blind into it? He answered as clearly as he could, treating it as a problem in applied physics rather than a legend. Soon after, a short paragraph appeared buried in a directive to armored units. In situations of extreme danger, it said field commanders could exercise discretion in the deployment of smoke munitions to aid withdrawal or repositioning of friendly forces. The language was cautious. The space it opened for judgment like Mercer's was small but real. For him and for Judith, the war did not end on that ridge. They moved to new sectors through forests where every tree might hide a gun and across fields where every hedgerow might explode. They endured a winter in Belgium that later earned its own name in history books. They lost friends. They kept moving. They survived. When his time in uniform ended, Mercer returned to Michigan with a duffel bag and a mind that now put bridges and battlefields on the same map. He finished his engineering degree. Equations that had once felt abstract now looked like tools. In Detroit, he found work designing the parts of cars nobody noticed until something went wrong. He sketched frames that would absorb impact mounts, that would keep engines from driving into cabins, restraints that would hold people where they belonged when steel met steel. Slow-motion film of test crashes became his new battlefield. Watching those films, he sometimes felt the same tightness behind his ribs that he had felt on St. Laurent Ridge. It eased when doors opened and test dummies stayed where they should. The math done early had turned violence into something people could walk away from. He spoke little about the war. When asked, he mentioned a tank, some cold days, and the fact that he had been lucky. Then he changed the subject. Only in a letter to his sister Evelyn did he set the ridge down in words that were not clipped and official. He wrote to her in his early 60s after retirement, when nights were quiet enough for old sounds to return. He told her about their childhood bridge over the creek and how proud he had felt when it held his weight. He wrote about the morning the news from Pearl Harbor had come over the radio and how it had felt like a line being drawn that he could not ignore. When he came to August of 1944, his handwriting slowed. He did not list ranges or angles. He wrote about standing in a tank holding a shell he was not supposed to fire, listening to orders that did not match the ground under his tracks, and watching men who would die if he did nothing. Sometimes the only right choice is the one nobody taught you to make, he wrote. Evelyn read the letter more than once. Then she folded it carefully and put it away. After Mercer died, his children and his sister cleared his house. In the back of a closet, they found a small box. Inside lay a folded map marked with pencil along a ridge line, a black and white photograph of 5 young men in front of a Sherman named Judith, and a single brass shell casing polished until it caught the light. On a scrap of paper, someone had written only St. Laurent. Evelyn remembered the letter. She contacted a military archive, the United States Army Heritage and Education Center in Pennsylvania. The archivist there listened, asked for copies, and then asked for the originals. They knew that history did not live only in famous names and big arrows on maps, but also in quiet objects that marked the moment when one person's judgment had bent events. Months later, a visitor walking through the center might come upon a modest exhibit tucked between larger displays. The sign above it read, "Split-second decisions, tactical judgment in the field." Behind the glass rested Mercer's map, the crew photograph, and the smooth brass casing. A plaque told the story in a few plain sentences. On August 7, 1944, during the German counterattack near Mortain, Lieutenant Daniel Mercer of the 30th Infantry Division ordered the firing of a white phosphorus smoke round without prior authorization. The resulting smoke curtain allowed nearly 200 American soldiers to withdraw from an encirclement with limited loss of life. A subsequent board of inquiry determined that he had acted outside protocol, but with sound tactical judgment. Beside the plaque was a short quote from a letter written by a private who had been there, a man named Harold Brooks. "I do not know the name of the man in the tank who fired that smoke round," it read, "but I know this. I owe him everything. We all do." Now anyone who paused long enough to read could see the name he had not known. No band played nearby. No one saluted as they walked past. Yet the choice represented in that polished casing had sent its echo forward. It had saved men in one narrow valley on one gray morning. It had nudged regulations toward trusting the eyes and judgment of officers on the ground. It had helped shape the thinking of an engineer who later spent his days trying to keep strangers alive when steel and speed betrayed them. An old man with a cane stood there once and studied the display for a long time. He read the name, the dates, the quote. His hand came up and rested lightly against the glass. "We were not just lucky," he said quietly. "Somebody chose." He turned away and moved on. History would not carve Daniel Mercer's face into stone. It did not need to. It remembered him in the survival of ordinary men and in the quiet weight of objects that prove a choice was made. On a gray morning in 1944, on a ridge above a valley whose name most people would never learn, a white phosphorus shell left the barrel of a Sherman that was not supposed to fire it. The smoke that followed hid a retreat that became a rescue and carried nearly 200 soldiers through a narrow space between the fate written on a staff map and the lives they went on to live. Long after the last threads of that smoke had vanished from the French sky, the weight of that choice remained like the brass casing on a museum shelf, and the memory in the minds of those who had once run through a sudden wall of gray and found on the far side that their war and their story were not over yet.